It was a little after 2:30 in the morning on the 17th of June, 1966. The place was a small tavern called the Lafayette Bar and Grill on a quiet corner in Paterson, New Jersey. Two men walked in. Then came the gunfire. When it ended, the bartender was gone. A customer was gone. And another customer had been struck down so badly that she would not survive her wounds. A fourth man lived, but he was blinded in one eye, marked for the rest of his life by what happened in those few seconds. Now hold that picture in your mind, because just 10 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled over a rental car not far from that bar. In the back seat sat a famous man, a fighter. A top-ranked middleweight contender who had once dropped a world champion to the canvas in the very first round. The officers recognized him at once because he was a well-known and controversial local figure. They looked him over, and then they let him go. Months later, that same man would be arrested anyway. He would be convicted, sent away, and would lose nearly 2 decades of his life to a case that a federal judge would one day describe as built upon, in the court's own words, an appeal to racism rather than reason, and concealment rather than disclosure. His name was Rubin Carter. The world knew him as the Hurricane, and tonight we trace all of it, the rise of a feared and electric prizefighter. The frame that swallowed him whole. The long, grinding war he fought from inside a prison cell, and the strange peace, the place he later called heaven, that he claimed to find only after everything had been taken from him. But to understand how the state of New Jersey could pursue one man for 22 long years, you have to go back to the beginning, back to a boy in Clifton who learned far too early that the world was not built to protect him. Rubin Carter came into the world in 1937 in Clifton, New Jersey, the fourth of 7 children. By his own account, the first battle of his life was not in any ring. It was at home. He spoke later of a troubled relationship with a strict and demanding father, a man whose discipline was heavy and whose approval was hard to earn. For a restless, headstrong boy, that household was a pressure cooker, and the heat never seemed to let up. The world outside was no gentler. As a child, Carter carried a deeply painful experience from his early life, harm he later disclosed, a moment of private trauma that no boy should ever face. And here is where the story takes its first cruel turn. At the age of 11, after a serious incident stemming from a deeply painful experience in his early life, young Rubin was not treated as a child in need of protection. He was sent away to a juvenile reformatory. Think about that for a moment. 11 years old, and already swallowed by a system of confinement that would shadow him on and off for most of his life. That early collision with the justice system planted something in him, a wariness, a hardness, a sense that the rules bent differently depending on who you were. He did not stay behind those walls forever. In 1954, still just a teenager, Carter escaped from the reformatory. And with nowhere safe to land, he ran toward the one institution that might give a young man a new name and a fresh start. He enlisted in the United States Army. It was a desperate kind of freedom, a boy reinventing himself by leaving everything behind. But it was on a military base, far from the streets of New Jersey, all the way across the ocean, that this discharged troublemaker would stumble onto the one thing capable of turning his fists into a future. He completed his basic training at Fort Jackson in South Carolina, and from there, the Army sent him across the Atlantic to West Germany. And it was there, in uniform, on foreign soil, that the man we would come to know as the Hurricane first laced up a pair of boxing gloves in earnest. He began to box for the Army. It was almost accidental, the birth of an athlete. A young man with too much anger and too much energy suddenly found a place where all of that could be aimed, focused, and rewarded. In the ring, the very intensity that had landed him in trouble his whole life finally had a purpose. But the discipline of the ring did not yet carry over into the discipline of a soldier. In 1956, Carter was discharged from the Army, listed as unfit for service, after 4 separate courts-martial. The pattern that had haunted him since childhood had followed him into uniform. He could find structure inside the ropes, but he could not yet escape the chaos that surrounded the rest of his life. So he came home to New Jersey, and home is where the trouble waited. Before long, he was convicted in connection with 2 muggings, and once again, he found himself facing time in confinement. Each new run-in with the law deepened a reputation that would, years later, be turned into a weapon against him. The image of a hard, dangerous, controversial local figure. That label would prove far more lasting than any sentence. When the prison gates opened in September of 1961, Rubin Carter walked out with almost nothing to his name. Nothing except a body built for violence and a single decision burning inside him. He would make that violence legal. He would make it paid, and he would make it something the whole world wanted to watch. In 1961, fresh out of confinement, Rubin Carter turned professional, and on paper, he should not have been special. He stood only 5 foot 8 inches tall, fighting at a weight between 155 and 160 pounds, which made him shorter than most of the middleweights he faced. In a division built on reach and height, he gave away inches in nearly every bout. What he had instead was thunder in his hands. Carter fought with a relentless, charging forward style, the kind that did not wait, did not measure, did not dance. He came to end things early, and he frequently did, dropping opponents in the opening rounds before they ever got comfortable. Fans loved it. There was nothing cautious about him, nothing dull. A short, powerful man who walked through bigger fighters and knocked them flat. It earned him the perfect nickname. They called him the Hurricane. A knockout artist is box office, and Carter began climbing fast. He worked his way through a string of serious opponents, names that meant something to fight crowds of that era. Men like Florentino Fernandez, Holly Mims, Gomeo Brennan, and George Benton. Each victory pushed him higher, closer to the contenders, closer to the conversations about who deserved a shot at the crown. The boxing world took notice. In July of 1963, the most respected authority in the sport, the Ring magazine, listed Rubin Carter among its top 10 middleweight contenders for the very first time. A man who had spent so much of his life behind walls was now ranked among the best fighters on the planet in his division. And then, in a single round on a December night, Carter did something that made the entire boxing world stop and stare. He destroyed a man who had already worn the crown. The date was the 20th of December, 1963. Across the ring from Carter stood Emil Griffith, a fighter of genuine pedigree, a man who had been a world champion before and would be a world champion again. On reputation alone, Griffith was the more accomplished man. This was supposed to be a test of whether the hard-hitting newcomer truly belonged among the elite. It lasted barely a round. In that opening round, Carter caught Griffith, and the unthinkable happened. He floored the former world champion, not once, but twice. The crowd erupted, the kind of roar that tells you something rare is unfolding in real time. Before that first round was over, the fight was stopped. A technical knockout. Rubin Carter had taken a past and future world title holder and overwhelmed him in a matter of minutes. The result rewrote his standing overnight. The Ring magazine elevated Carter to the position of number 3 contender for the world middleweight title. Not the top spot, but close enough to feel the heat of it. Close enough that a single great night could now put a championship belt within his grasp. And there was something larger moving underneath all of this. In the early 1960s, with the long shadow of segregation still falling hard across American life, here was a black fighter who had come up through the streets and the reformatories of New Jersey, now standing 1 or 2 wins away from a world title. He was raw, undeniable talent in a sporting world that did not always make room for men like him. And to his admirers, he was proof that ability could not be ignored. That number 3 ranking earned him the prize every fighter dreams of, a shot at the world title against the reigning champion, Joey Giardello. But the night of the 14th of December, 1964, would not unfold the way the Hurricane had planned. The 14th of December, 1964, Philadelphia. 15 rounds scheduled, a world middleweight championship on the line. And across the ring stood the reigning title holder, Joey Giardello. This was the moment Rubin Carter had clawed his way toward through the gyms, the prize rings, and the long climb up the rankings. Everything in his hard life had pointed at this single night. And early on, it looked like it might be his. In the 4th round, Carter found his opening. He landed those heavy rights to the head, the same kind of punches that had erased fighters before they knew what hit them. Giardello staggered. For a few electric seconds, the crown seemed to be slipping loose, ready to fall onto the head of the short, ferocious challenger from New Jersey. The arena could feel it. Carter could feel it. But he could not close the door. Whatever instinct tells a knockout artist exactly when to leap forward and finish, it did not arrive in time. Giardello survived the round. And a wounded champion is a dangerous thing. By the 5th, Giardello had gathered himself, steadied his feet, and begun to take control of the fight. Round by round, the more experienced man imposed his rhythm, boxing smartly, blunting the Hurricane's charge, turning a near disaster into a measured, disciplined performance. When the 15 rounds were over, the judges did not hesitate. The decision was unanimous, and it went to Joey Giardello. The title stayed exactly where it had been. For Rubin Carter, that night would stand as the closest he would ever come to a world championship. He had rocked a champion and let him escape. And in this brutal sport, escapes are rarely offered twice. He was still ranked, still feared, still a name that sold tickets. But the door that had swung open in the 4th round had quietly closed, and it would never open that wide again. What came next was not a slow fade. It was something harder. The year ahead would bring a reckoning that tested not just his record, but his body, including a beating he would later describe as the worst of his entire life, inside the ring or out of it. People remember the Hurricane as the man who flattened a former champion in a single round. What they tend to forget is what came afterward, in 1965, when the sport began to push back. It was a punishing year. Carter fought 9 times, and on the surface, 5 wins might sound respectable. But look closer at the losses. In 4 bouts against top contenders, he came away beaten 3 times, falling to Luis Manuel Rodriguez, to Dick Tiger, and to Harry Scott. These were not soft setups or tune-up fights. These were elite men, and against the best of them, the Hurricane was no longer the unstoppable force he had been. The Dick-Tiger fight was the cruelest of all. Tiger, a formidable and respected champion in his own right, put Carter on the canvas not once, not twice, but 3 times in a single bout. For a fighter whose entire identity was built on being the one who did the knocking down, it was a humbling, almost unrecognizable picture. Carter reportedly said afterward that it was the worst beating he had taken in his life, inside or outside the ring. Whether or not those were his exact words, the punishment was real, and it left a mark. The numbers tell the rest. By the end of 1965, the ring had dropped Carter to the number 5 middleweight ranking. Still respectable, but a clear slide from the heights he had reached after the Griffith stoppage. The aura of inevitability was gone. His final professional fight came on the 5th of August, 1966, against Juan Carlos Rivero. He lost on points. And with that quiet defeat, the boxing career of Rubin Carter came to its end, finishing with a record of 27 wins, 19 of them by knockout, against 12 losses and a single draw across 40 fights. A hard, honest, dangerous career, but not a championship one. Yet here is the haunting part of the timeline. By the time Carter laced up against Rivero in August, the night that would truly define his life had already happened weeks earlier. In the dark early hours inside a Paterson tavern he always insisted he never entered. Return now to that summer night and slow it down, because everything that came after grew out of a few terrible minutes. It was around 2:30 in the morning on the 17th of June, 1966. Inside the Lafayette Bar and Grill in Paterson, New Jersey, the last of the night's customers lingered. Then 2 gunmen stepped through the door and opened fire. The bartender, a man named James Oliver, was lost his life where he stood. A customer, Fred Noyox, passed away at the scene as well. A woman named Hazel Tanis was struck by multiple wounds and would fight for her life in a hospital before finally dying about a month later. A 4th person inside, Willie Marins, somehow survived, though he carried a head wound that left him blinded in one eye for the rest of his days. 4 innocent people, an ordinary tavern, and a burst of violence that shattered all of it in seconds. Now here is the first crack in the case that would later be built against Rubin Carter, a crack that was there from the very beginning. When police questioned the 2 survivors, both told them the same essential thing. The shooters had been black males, but neither survivor pointed to Carter. Neither pointed to a younger man named John Artis. At the scene, in the immediate aftermath, the men who would eventually be convicted of this crime were not identified by the people who had actually seen it happen. That detail matters because of where this crime took place and when. Paterson, in the middle of the 1960s, was a city carrying real racial tension, and the country around it was living through the upheaval of the civil rights era, with deeply rooted injustice woven into how the law often treated black men. In that climate, a famous, hard-edged black fighter, already known to local police as a controversial figure, made for an unsettlingly convenient name to attach to an unsolved tragedy. And the strangest contradiction of the entire case was about to unfold. Because just 10 minutes after the gunfire, a police cruiser pulled over a rental car carrying Rubin Carter and John Artis, and what the officers chose to do next would never quite add up. 10 minutes. That was all the time that had passed since the shooting, when a police cruiser stopped a rental car not far from the Lafayette Bar and Grill. Inside that car were 3 people. John Artis was behind the wheel. A man named John Royster sat in the passenger seat, and in the back seat sat Rubin Carter, the well-known fighter. The men returning from a night out at a nearby bar called the Night Spot. The officers looked them over. They recognized Carter at once, the famous, controversial local figure. And then, knowing exactly who he was, knowing a triple shooting had just occurred minutes before, they let the men drive away. Sit with that for a moment. If the police truly believed they had 2 killers in front of them, fresh from the scene, why release them? The decision is one of the great unanswered contradictions of the case, and it points to a simple, stubborn fact. In those first hours, there was nothing concrete tying Carter or Artis to the murders. That absence of evidence never went away. There was no forensic proof linking either man to the killings. The lead detective on the case, a man named DeSimone, would later claim he had not had enough time to bring in an expert to administer gun residue tests, the kind of testing that might have settled the question one way or another. What he did arrange were lie detector tests, and by the account that has come down through the case, Carter and Artis passed them. Then came perhaps the clearest sign of how thin the case truly was. Carter and Artis voluntarily went before a grand jury. They did not hide. They did not run. They walked in and faced the process directly, and that grand jury, weighing what existed at the time, found there was no case to answer. The system, looking at the evidence in front of it, found nothing worth pursuing. For months, it appeared the whole matter would quietly fade, an unsolved horror with no charges to show for it. But it did not fade, because a man named Alfred Bellow was about to change everything, and he would do it only after police caught him in the middle of a crime of his own. For months after the killings, the trail had gone cold. No charges, no suspects in custody, just a city carrying the weight of an unsolved tragedy. And then, several months later, the entire picture changed because of one man. His name was Alfred Bellow. Here is what makes Bellow's role so troubling. When police looked closely at where he had been that night, they discovered he had not been an innocent passerby at all. He had been in the area for a reason of his own, acting as a lookout while an associate broke into a nearby business. Bellow was, in other words, a man caught in the middle of a crime, a man with every reason in the world to bargain his way into the good graces of the police. And bargain he did. Bellow revised his account and now positively identified John Artis as one of the gunmen. Soon after, an associate of his named Arthur Bradley stepped forward as well, pointing the finger at Rubin Carter as the second shooter. 2 men, both tangled up in criminal activity of their own, suddenly remembered with certainty what no survivor inside that tavern had ever been able to say. There was money hanging over all of this, too. Bellow would later allege that he had been promised a reward of more than $10,000 for helping catch the killers, a sum he said he was never actually paid. Whether the promise drove his words or simply shadowed them, it hung over his credibility like a stain that would never quite wash out. But in that moment, it was enough. On the strength of these shifted identifications, with no forensic evidence to back them, Rubin Carter and John Artis were arrested and indicted for murder. The case that the system had once found too weak to pursue had suddenly come roaring back to life, built almost entirely on the word of 2 compromised men. And so, the matter moved toward trial. In 1967, the fate of the hurricane would be placed in the hands of 12 jurors who looked nothing like the men in the dock. 1967, a New Jersey courtroom, and seated in the jury box, according to the historical record of the case, 12 white jurors who would decide whether 2 black men would ever walk free again. The trial unfolded against everything we have already seen: the absence of physical proof, the survivors who had never named these defendants, the reward-shadowed testimony of witnesses with troubles of their own. And yet, when it was over, the jury returned the verdict the prosecution wanted. Rubin Carter and John Ardis were both convicted of first-degree murder. There was one mercy, if it can be called that. The jurors attached a recommendation of mercy to their verdict, and that recommendation spared the 2 men from a passing sentence. They would live, but the life that remained to them was about to be measured out in iron and concrete. The sentencing fell to Judge Samuel Larner, and it was crushing. He imposed 3 life sentences upon each defendant. For Carter, 2 of those life terms were ordered to run consecutively, one after the other, a punishment designed to ensure he would grow old and die behind those walls. In a single afternoon, a former number 3 contender for the middleweight crown of the world was transformed into a man with no foreseeable future beyond a prison cell. Step back and look at the whole shape of it. 2 black men stood convicted of killing 3 white people in a tense New Jersey city in the middle of the civil rights era, on evidence that would not survive serious scrutiny. The racial dimension was not a footnote to this case. It sat at the very center of it, and it would take nearly 2 decades and a federal court to finally say so out loud. But Rubin Carter did not behave like a guilty man resigned to his fate. Inside, he refused to wear the uniform of an ordinary inmate, refused to accept the role the state had assigned him. And from his cell, with little more than paper and conviction, he began to write the story that would one day pull a movement, a song, and the most famous athlete on earth to his side. A man who cannot get the courts to listen has only one weapon left: his own voice. And Rubin Carter used it. While still in confinement, he wrote his autobiography, a raw account of his life and his case, titled The 16th Round. In 1974, Viking Press published it, and suddenly, Carter was no longer just a name in a court file. He was an author, telling his own story to the public, insisting on his innocence in his own words, reaching people the legal system had kept far away from him. That same year brought a stunning development inside the case itself. The 2 men whose identifications had sent Carter and Ardis away, Alfred Bellow and Arthur Bradley, withdrew their accounts. They took back the very testimony that had built the convictions. It should have changed everything. But Judge Larner denied the motion for a new trial, dismissing the recantations as lacking what he called the ring of truth. The words came back. The freedom did not. Yet the tide of public opinion had begun to turn, and it turned hard. A prominent Madison Avenue advertising executive named George Lois organized a public campaign on Carter's behalf, and the cause caught fire among the famous and the powerful. The heavyweight champion, Muhammad Ali, the most recognizable athlete alive, lent his name to the fight, publicly backing Carter's appeal during an appearance on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson in September of 1973. Then came the song that burned the story into the national memory. Bob Dylan co-wrote and recorded a piece simply titled Hurricane, released in 1975, a driving, furious ballad that declared Carter innocent to millions of listeners. Dylan did not stop at the recording studio. On the 7th of December, 1975, he performed the song live for the inmates at Trenton State Prison, where Carter was being held at the time. The momentum felt unstoppable. A book, a movement, a champion, an anthem. But the campaign was about to slam into a wall, because an allegation surfacing during Carter's brief time on bail would cause his celebrity support to collapse almost as fast as it had risen. For a moment, it truly looked as though the walls might come down. The New Jersey Supreme Court took up the case, and in a unanimous ruling, the justices found that crucial deals made between prosecutors and their key witnesses had been kept hidden from the defense. That concealment, the court held, had substantially prejudiced the defendant's right to a fair trial. The original convictions were set aside, and Carter and Artis were granted something they had been denied for years: a new trial. Carter was released on bail in 1976, breathing free air for the first time in nearly a decade. And then, almost immediately, the ground shifted beneath him. An allegation made during his time on bail caused a significant loss of public support. Carter denied the accusation, and no criminal charges were ever filed over it. But the damage was swift and severe. The celebrity backing that had carried his cause, the famous names and glittering campaign, eroded almost overnight. The movement that had felt unstoppable suddenly went quiet. And the second trial did not bring the deliverance his supporters had prayed for. After hearing the case again, a jury once more found Rubin Carter and John Artis guilty of the murders. The same crushing sentences were reimposed, sending Carter back into confinement to resume the life the state had designed for him. It was a devastating reversal, a door that had cracked open and then slammed shut with even greater force. The two co-defendants would now walk separate roads. John Artis was eventually released on parole in 1981, stepping back into the world. But Rubin Carter remained behind bars, the man at the center of the storm, the name on the song, the author of the book, still locked away for a crime he never stopped insisting he did not commit. By now, he had lost the better part of 2 decades, his career long gone, his celebrity allies scattered, his appeals exhausted in the state courts. To most observers, the story looked finished, but Carter had one path left, a final door no state court could close, and behind it waited a federal judge who would read the record of this case and see something the state of New Jersey had spent years refusing to admit. The state courts had failed him twice, so Rubin Carter's defenders did the one thing left to do. They took the entire case into the federal system, filing a petition for a writ of habeas corpus, the legal mechanism that allows a federal judge to examine whether a prisoner is being held in violation of the Constitution itself. This was no small undertaking. Carter's defense was built by a determined team, the attorneys Myron Beldock and Louis Steele, working alongside the constitutional scholar Leon Friedman. Together, they assembled the full record of everything that had happened across nearly 20 years, and they laid it before the United States District Court for the District of New Jersey, before a judge named H. Lee Sorokin. And on the 7th of November, 1985, Judge Sorokin handed down a decision that would echo for decades. He set aside the convictions. In his ruling, he found that the case against Carter had been, in his own words, predicated upon an appeal to racism rather than reason, and concealment rather than disclosure. The judge placed the racial dimension at the very heart of his opinion. 2 black men had been convicted of killing 3 white people, and the prosecution, in the court's judgment, had leaned on prejudice rather than proof. Carter, by then 48 years old, was freed without bail. After more than 18 years inside, the man who had entered prison as a fighter in his prime walked out into the cold November air as a graying middle-aged man. The case is preserved in the federal record under the citation Carter v. Rafferty, a landmark that students of the law still study today. But the state of New Jersey was not finished. Prosecutors fought the ruling with everything they had, appealing all the way to the United States Supreme Court, which declined to hear the case. The legal war ground on until February of 1988, when a Passaic County judge formally dismissed the original indictments, closing a saga that had stretched across 22 years. The state's own Attorney General, W. Carey Edwards, conceded that prosecution was no longer legally feasible after so long. Carter had walked out a free man. But freedom, he would soon discover, brought its own kind of cage. Imagine stepping into daylight after losing the better part of 2 decades. The world had moved on without you. The career was gone. The fame had curdled. And the man who emerged was not the same man who had been locked away. Carter did not return to New Jersey. He went north to Toronto and moved in with the very advocates who had fought to free him, living among them in a communal home. It should have felt like sanctuary. Instead, in a detail that reveals just how deeply confinement had marked him, Carter later described that household as feeling like another prison. A man who had spent so long under someone else's control struggled to live under any roof where he was not fully his own master. His personal life carried its own quiet wreckage. The marriage from his earlier years to a woman named May Thelma Baskett had ended over his infidelity, dissolving after the birth of their second child. And his attempt at a relationship after prison proved difficult and brief, a strained chapter in a private life that never quite found steady ground. The years behind bars had cost him things that no court ruling could ever give back, the ordinary intimacies and partnerships that most people build across a lifetime. So Carter did what he had always done. He reinvented himself. He became a Canadian citizen, building a new identity in a new country, far from the New Jersey streets and courtrooms that had nearly destroyed him. And slowly, the former contender began to transform into something the world had never expected from the man they once called the Hurricane. Not a fighter, a crusader. The man who had spent his best years caged would now spend his remaining decades trying to break open cages for others. And every year, on a single date that meant more to him than any birthday, he would mark his freedom with one quiet phone call. The anger that had once fueled a knockout artist found a new target. Rubin Carter turned the full force of his will toward the wrongly convicted, the people still trapped in the same machinery that had nearly buried him alive. From 1993 until 2005, he served as executive director of the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, a Canadian organization devoted to freeing innocent prisoners. He was no longer just a symbol of injustice. He was a working advocate, lending his name, his story, and his hard-won understanding of the system to people the world had forgotten. The boxing world, too, finally offered a measure of recognition that had eluded him in his fighting days. In 1993, the World Boxing Council presented Carter with an honorary championship belt, awarded at the same banquet where his old rival Joey Giardello received one as well. The two men who had fought for the middleweight crown nearly 30 years earlier stood honored, side by side. Carter would also take his place in the New Jersey Boxing Hall of Fame, the state that had imprisoned him at last acknowledging the fighter it had once tried to erase. His advocacy only deepened. According to biography.com, in 2004, Carter founded his own organization, Innocence International, broadening his mission still further. The following year, in 2005, 2 universities recognized his work with honorary doctorates of law, York University in Toronto and Griffith University in Australia. The boy who had been sent away at 11 was now addressed as Dr. Carter. And he held to his principles, even when it cost him. In 2005, he resigned from the very organization he had led, parting ways over a disputed judicial appointment he could not in good conscience accept. His convictions, in every sense of that word, were not for sale. His story reached its widest audience in 1999, when the film The Hurricane brought his life to theaters around the world, with Denzel Washington portraying Carter in a performance that introduced a whole new generation to the case. Yet through all the honors and the fame, one private ritual mattered most. Every year, on the 7th of November, Carter picked up the telephone and called Judge Sorokin, marking the anniversary of the day he was reborn. In 2012, on the far side of the world, Carter would stand before an international audience and reveal that the body once called a hurricane was finally running out of time. In March of 2012, while attending an international justice conference in Western Australia, Rubin Carter shared news that silenced the room. He had been diagnosed with terminal prostate cancer, and the doctors had given him only 3 to 6 months to live. The man who had survived reformatories, prison, and a 22-year legal war was now facing the one opponent no fighter ever beats. What happened next is among the most moving turns in the whole story. The friend who came to care for him in those final months was John Artis, the same man who had been arrested beside him that night in 1966, who had sat in the same dock, who had served years for the same crime neither of them committed. Artis moved in and looked after Carter as the illness advanced, a bond forged in injustice and carried faithfully to the very end. Carter outlived his prognosis by far. And in February of 2014, knowing the end was near, he published an op-ed in the New York Daily News titled Hurricane Carter's Dying Wish. In it, he reflected on the strange arc of his life with a clarity that few ever reach. He wrote that he had lived in hell for the first 49 years and had been in heaven for the past 28. The years of freedom, hard as they had been, were the years he treasured. He spent some of his final strength fighting for someone else. Carter championed the case of a Brooklyn man named David McCallum, wrongly imprisoned since 1985, the very year Carter himself had been freed. It was the work of a man determined to keep breaking open cages until his last breath. Rubin Carter passed away on the 20th of April, 2014, at the age of 76. 6 months later, in October of that same year, David McCallum was exonerated and set free. Carter did not live to see it, but his fight had helped make it happen. In the years since, his story has refused to fade. A 13-part podcast series built from 40 hours of his own recorded interviews carried his voice forward to listeners who never saw him fight. And that, in the end, is the truest legacy of the hurricane. Not the knockouts, not the rankings, not even the famous song. It is the simple, stubborn fact that a man who lost almost everything to injustice spent the time he had left making sure others would not.